Welcome back to the Sherry Sylvester Show. We are taping the podcast today from the Texas Public Policy Foundation's annual Policy Summit. I've got back on the show my old friend, Ray Sullivan, who is an icon in media in Texas. Ray was the chief of staff to Governor Rick Perry and a spokesperson for the Bush-Cheney campaign. He's got a whole other resume as an advocate in the tech sector. We see him around the Capitol all the time. But with everything that's going on in media now, which has changed dramatically since January 20th, I wanted to talk to Ray about what he is seeing, what's the old media look like, what does the new media look like. And before we were getting ready to start the show, he said to me, the legacy media committed suicide. What do you mean by that, the legacy media committed suicide? And Ray, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Good to see you. Always a pleasure to be with you. What I mean by that is that they have, over the past decade or more, certainly in the last 4 years, have damaged their credibility to the point where it is difficult to believe what they say. Whether you look at the decline of President Biden in office that was not reported on, the Russiagate, which was a non-event but occupied 2 years of headlines in mainstream media. This audience knows full well what was done most recently during the Trump years and the Biden years, what was covered up and what was amplified. But it was just a sort of a death knell after years of chipping away at their own credibility because of, in my view, a left-wing political bias that seeped into much of what they did. And I remember having a conversation years ago with a Texas reporter, sort of along these lines, saying, look, it is bad for the country and for the state to have a media that is not regarded and respected. I mean, it's they're to some extent, or at least traditionally, have been the referees, much like in a football game, and kind of much like we're seeing the referees tainted by a perceived bias for the Kansas City Chiefs, which is undermining referee credibility. The media is way beyond that, and it have really undermined their own credibility and given rise to alternative sources of information that folks are gobbling up to the detriment of mainstream and traditional media.
Well, it's, I remember, and you were a spokesman for Bush-Cheney for a while, and they called Bush Hitler as well. How did the media lose the thread so completely? I mean, in terms of this, they did commit suicide. They have no credibility. I think the last I read, 31%, which is high, trust them.
Yeah.
But there's no, you can't even have a conversation with a reporter now.
I think it's a combination of groupthink, and they run in their own echo chambers. National media, New York and Washington, talk to each other and socialize with each other and compete with each other in terms of jobs that are controlled by folks who think like them, or even further to the left. The other is just again, it's maybe an overused term, but the derangement syndrome that was pretty pronounced during Bush.
And people forget that.
Right.
I think that Trump was the first to
during
get...
the Iraq War and the vitriol that was poured on the president and the...
Yeah, I remember the bishop of my church said that George W. Bush had made us all ashamed to be Americans.
That's what got the Dixie Chicks in trouble.
Right, yeah.
Now the Chicks. But it does seem like what I can't quite figure out is why they can't snap out of it. Even after all this time, even after this shocking maybe not shocking, but shocking to them defeat that they and Biden just suffered. They seem to be doubling down now on continuing to trash President Trump, to trash Republicans, and to double down on the same messages and the same issues that did not work with the voters, and again, don't seem to be interested in reclaiming their credibility.
And looking at censorship, like somehow we Republicans in the majority have gotten bad information. So let's shut down all that information. It's
The
amazing.
Margaret
to me.
Brennan thing this weekend.
Oh, wow. That was.
I don't watch those shows anymore.
No.
But I happened to be flipping channels and saw that piece, and I'm like, did she just say that Nazis were for free speech? And anyway, it's again derangement syndrome to the nth degree.
They don't back down. They really don't back down. And it seems like one of the things that we're seeing in Trump's media strategy, which has been called full spectrum dominance, because he is moving the alternative media from the podcasters, from the digital, from all the stuff that he does. It's cultural. Going to the Daytona 500, going to the Super Bowl. You really do see him. And he's very, very transparent. These executive orders are enormously transparent. And so it's harder to go after him. I mean, with Biden, it was easy to go after him for us because you had no idea what he was doing.
He didn't either sometimes.
I wanted to ask you about some of the principles that you and I have been doing this for 20, 30 years that we've always had in media, and which of them still stand the test of time. One of the things we used to say was, don't repeat the negative. Is that still true?
I still think it is a truth and important. President Trump seems to speak more from a stream of consciousness, and I'm not sure he practices that himself. But I still think that, particularly when you're trying to further a message or respond to a negative question or an attack question from the news media, staying focused on your message and your positive message is a good thing, and not taking the bait on, when did you stop beating your wife? Type questions.
Right. I wouldn't characterize our relationship that way.
Right.
Is the correct answer to that question. What about don't fight with people who buy ink by the barrel? Don't fight with the media.
I don't think that is a truism anymore. I remember back in the 2012 election cycle, when I was communications director for then candidate Rick Perry. Perry dropped out right before South Carolina and endorsed Newt Gingrich.
Right.
And Gingrich spent much of the subsequent debate bashing the media. Because they started to pepper him with some really nasty questions, and he just went off on them. And it actually built a lot of momentum and enthusiasm for him. He ended up winning, if I recall, South Carolina.
Right.
At least when it comes to Republican, and I would argue probably independent voters, pushing back on the press, exposing, questioning, criticizing the press seems to pay great dividends for Republican elected officials and for candidates.
Right.
I'm not sure it is necessarily good for society. It would be better if you had a news media that didn't need to be or provide cause for that criticism. But at some point in the last couple of decades, I think the public just got sick and tired of again, the perception that the referees are siding with one team and not the other.
Right. You know, I can never understand being in the conservative majority in Texas and having worked for lieutenant governor, you've worked for governors, why they weren't just more interested in us. I mean, the one reporter I remember who I always testify in support of was Jonathan Tylove, who was, of course, an East Coast liberal.
Right.
And we were like foreign to him. He
Yeah.
was very interested in how did we think? How did we come up with this? His coverage was very fair, and we knew he hated.
Agreed.
But there's not that kind of interest.
I think again, not to do too much psychoanalysis, and I'm certainly not qualified and don't frankly pay that much attention, but if you think about what type of young person would go into the journalism business, I'm guessing it's more of an activist than a
now for sure.
journalist.
Yeah.
And I think that is what we're seeing more often than not in the press corps is journalists who are trying to forward a particular way of thinking or particular agenda. It's particularly true, well, it's kind of across the board, but the experiences that I've had, and I don't deal with the media much directly anymore, but when I did most recently, it's the environmental stuff is just so embedded almost to a religious level with some of those folks. I remember having a conversation with, I think it was E&E News, which is an environmental publication, and was asking about climate change and all this other stuff. And I said, look, you can be a Republican and be for cleaner air and be for lowering emissions without being a climate alarmist or a doomsday climate theorist. And I just didn't get a response.
Right.
So I think that's where things are at the moment. And again, it has given rise to a whole other way to get your message out as an elected official or candidate, or even now, corporations and associations and people don't have to go through the legacy media, mainstream media, the way that they used to.
It's interesting. When we looked at who's here now, I mean, it's certainly in this election, Joe Rogan, so powerful, may have been a fatal mistake. I don't think it's a fatal mistake that Kamala Harris didn't go on Joe Rogan,
no.
But certainly a big win that both Vance and Trump did. But one of the questions that you have asked is who are these people? Who is Joe Rogan? He's a comedian, right? He's a.
That's what I mentioned to you before we started, that I'm a little bit concerned about who the new like mouthpieces or microphones are. And how do we know, not to be paranoid or anything, but how do we know that they're not on someone's payroll or foreign government's payroll, or whether they have an agenda that folks don't know about?
Right.
And I'm not sure how to answer that question. I don't think the government needs to set any rules or provide any disclosure requirements. But at least traditionally, even if you knew that the New York Times reporter was a liberal, you could pretty much trust that they weren't a foreign asset or on a payroll outside of the newspaper itself. And I'm just not sure. It'd be interesting to see over time whether any issues come up along those lines, especially with what we've seen in recent years with foreign governments trying to influence social media or own, in the case of TikTok, own social media that has a pretty big influence on the U.S. population.
Yeah.
Um, just something to think about. Bottom line is, and again, this is something I think that has been lost, is voters, citizens need to spend more time on finding source material, original source material for news stories, um, being having a healthy level of skepticism. In my case, I only recently in the last few months have gotten on Instagram, and I like looking at it.
Uh-huh.
Um, but if I see something that strikes me from a news standpoint or strikes me as provocative, the first thing I do is try to find other sources to see if is that a real story or not, is that a real thing or not, and sometimes it is, and many times it isn't something that you can prove up. I'm concerned whether most Americans, or certainly up and coming voters and citizens, whether they have that level of skepticism or whether they have the energy to go seek out additional information, or do they just believe what they see on their phone? And if it's the latter, that's a little bit scary.
And so many news stories, the reference is a tweet.
Yeah.
You'll go and see the reference as a tweet, or you'll see something I saw at Cy-Fair ISD, third largest school district in the state. The school board passed a regulation last week that if a kid is at school and he's presenting himself as herself as a different sex or saying he wants to be called by a different name, the teachers have to call the parents. So the Houston Chronicle reports that many parents showed up to protest this. Well, I'm looking, there's maybe 50, 60 parents in the audience. There's 120,000 students in Cy-Fair.
Yeah.
And then they cited a couple of tweets. This is not news.
Right.
And there seems to be, this is a big story. And the side of the parents, if you go to follow the polling, it's an 80-20 issue.
Yeah.
But this is not news,
Yeah. It's I guess it's enough for them to write a story around.
Right.
And you see that a lot. Again, particularly on social media, but even in outlets like Fox. At the end of some of the programs, they'll put people's tweets up, and you're like, that's interesting, but it's one dude's tweet.
It's like the people holding the signs out in front of Good Morning America. I mean, that's the impact that it has. So Trump, with this full spectrum dominance, this news is coming at us very, very fast, and that's changed in the last 25 days. Can we sustain that? What do you think?
First, I think it is certainly innovative, and I think it is serving him well at the moment. And part of that is the dramatic distinction in energy level and activity between Biden and Trump. And showing the energy and enthusiasm that he has. He's also focused on the issues that won him the election. Border, reducing the size and scope and cost of government, boys and girls sports, all things that he ran on and that won him the election in a profound way, and flooding the zone. I do wonder, however, whether it is sustainable. I think there's some risk in either news consumer fatigue or causing excessive anxiety because no one can figure out what the news of the day is, or what crisis is or isn't there. I also still think that there is a reason to hammer home and explain the issues that you're working on. And in the current environment of sort of flooding the zone, or I think Steve Bannon called it muzzle velocity of news coverage. There's a whole lot of information. I mean, a whole lot of issues and sound bites, but in terms of a deeper dive and actual facts and results, that hasn't really been fully fleshed out yet. So I think for now, it is really helping with the transition and helping show this a brave new world. And there's a leader who's energetic and who is doing what he said he would do. But the chaotic nature of it, I'm not sure is sustainable over time.
It's interesting. Your old colleague, Brooke Rollins, Secretary of Agriculture, spoke at lunch, and she quoted Hamilton. And she said that one of the things that Hamilton had said in Federal at 70 was that vitality of the executive was critical to the success of government.
Yeah.
And I think we really do see that vitality.
Yeah.
But there's some of these issues. I listened to some old Barack Obama staffers the other day, and they were talking about their frustration because they said, we knew this waste was in the government, but we couldn't figure out how to get rid of it. They admitted that. Maybe they weren't committed to getting rid of it because we see the Democrats, it's interesting, they've made it their business to now start advocating in favor of waste.
Right.
But they knew it was there. But the big questions are tough. A lot of the things that he wants to cut now, we're okay with that. But nobody wants to cut Social Security.
Right. Yeah.
And nobody wants to cut Medicare.
The so-called entitlement reform has really been shelved by both parties.
Right.
And that's where the big bucks are.
Right. It'll be interesting. Well, we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but what do you think about changing Governor Abbott? I know you had to miss lunch, but he quibbled a little bit with Gulf of America. He thinks we should have gone with Gulf of Texas, which makes a lot more sense.
I think Gulf of Texas rolls off the tongue better.
It does. And plus, you know where it is then.
Right.
It is our Gulf.
Right.
But some of us here, TPPF obviously doesn't have a position on Greenland. We may have several positions on Greenland, but we think maybe Texas should buy Greenland.
That is, I'll tell you, I will credit the Trump folks for bringing up some issues that are legit and that some folks I'd never thought about Greenland before in my life. But when you look at it strategically, militarily, from a natural resources standpoint, makes a lot of sense to have ownership or greater involvement in that piece of land just to our north.
Yeah.
So we'll see what can be done there. Classic Trump, kind of leading with bombast, and you get people sometimes freaked out or firmed up in their position. But I can't imagine that it's the Netherlands, right, that controls them?
Denmark,
I'm sorry. That they feel real strongly about spending all that money, and it seems like a pretty good deal if the U.S. government were to try to take that over, and also a really good deal for the people who live there.
Yeah.
If they get treated like folks in Samoa or Guam or Puerto Rico.
Exactly. And of course, nobody knows better than the people of Texas what it's like when you're formerly a country
Right.
and then become a territory.
Yes.
Ray, thank you so much for dropping by. We could talk about the media forever, but really good to have you here at the Policy Summit.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
Thank you all for joining us today on the Sherry Sylvester Show. You can sign up for the Sherry Sylvester Show at Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to sign up for my newsletter, which includes the weekly winners and losers, go to www.texaspolicy.com/9th in Congress.